The Haunted Cabin. The forest was dark and silent. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot as the teenagers walked through the trees. They were on a dare to go into the forest at night and see if they could find the old abandoned cabin that was said to be haunted. The teenagers had heard stories about the cabin for years. They said that it was built in the 1800s by a man who had gone mad and killed his family. The man had then hanged himself in the cabin, and his ghost was said to still haunt the place. The teenagers didn't believe the stories, but they were still a little scared. They walked slowly through the forest, their eyes darting around, looking for any sign of the cabin. After a while, they came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a small cabin. It was made of wood and had a sagging roof. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges.
The teenagers stopped at the edge of the clearing. They looked at each other, and then they looked at the cabin. "Do you want to go in?" one of the teenagers asked.
"No," another teenager said. "I'm scared." "Me too," a third teenager said.
The teenagers stood there for a moment, looking at each other and then at the cabin. Finally, one of them took a deep breath and said, "I'll go in."
The teenager stepped forward and walked towards the cabin. The other teenagers followed behind him. The teenager reached the door and hesitated. He looked back at the other teenagers, and then he took a deep breath and opened the door. The teenagers stepped inside the cabin. It was dark and dusty. The only light came from a few cracks in the walls. The teenagers stood there for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness. Then, they started to look around. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished. There was a bed in one corner, a table in the middle of the room, and a fireplace in the other corner. The teenagers walked over to the table. On the table was a book. The teenager picked up the book and opened it. The book was old and dusty. The pages were yellowed and brittle. The teenager started to read. The book was a diary. It was written by the man who had built the cabin. The man wrote about his life, his family, and his madness. The teenagers read the diary for a while. They learned about the man's childhood, his marriage, and his children. They also learned about his descent into madness. The man wrote about how he had started to hear voices. He wrote about how he had seen visions. He wrote about how he had killed his family. The teenagers were horrified by what they were reading. They couldn't believe that a man could do such terrible things. The teenager who was reading the diary closed the book and put it down. He looked at the other teenagers, and then he said, "We should go." The other teenagers nodded. They turned and walked out of the cabin. The teenagers walked back through the forest. They didn't say anything. They were all too shaken up by what they had seen. When they reached the edge of the forest, they stopped and looked back at the cabin. It was dark and silent. The only sound was the wind blowing through the trees. The teenagers turned and walked away. They didn't look back. The teenagers never went back to the cabin. They never spoke of what they had seen. But the memory of the cabin still haunts them to this day. Daily horror stories that happened to me. Another day, another story.